Stop trying. Seriously, just stop. Because the moment you stop trying to make something happen, that's exactly when it starts happening. And I know that sounds backwards. I know it sounds like one of those things people say when they've given up. But what if I told you the reason your life feels stuck right now has nothing to do with what you're doing wrong and everything to do with what you're feeling wrong? You see, most people are walking around like they're trying to convince reality. They're checking their bank accounts, refreshing their emails, looking for signs that something is changing. They're watching the world, waiting for permission to feel good. But here's what nobody tells you. The world isn't the cause of your experience, it's the echo. And an echo can only repeat what's already been spoken. Think about that for a second. Everything you're seeing right now, every frustrating circumstance, every disappointing outcome, it's not happening to you. It's happening from you. Your outer world is just playing back yesterday's inner assumptions. So if you're waiting for the world to change before you feel different, you've got it completely backwards. You have to feel different first, and not just think different, feel different. Because there's this thing most people miss entirely. They repeat affirmations, they visualize, they think positive thoughts, and nothing changes. Why? Because underneath all of that, they still feel like someone who's waiting, someone who's hoping, someone who's trying to get something they don't have. And that feeling, that sense of lack, that's what's creating their reality. Life doesn't respond to your words or your thoughts, it responds to your state, to what you're silently accepting as true right now. Here's where it gets interesting. The moment you truly feel something is done, the struggle ends. Not because you worked harder, not because you figured out the right technique, but because when the struggle ends, resistance has nothing left to hold on to. Most people think they need to push through resistance, fight through obstacles, prove themselves worthy. But resistance isn't out there in the world. It never was. Resistance is just the gap between what you want and what you secretly believe is true. Let me ask you something. Think of something you already have. Maybe it's your phone. Maybe it's your bed. Maybe it's your favorite coffee mug. Now, do you sit around affirming that it's yours? Do you visualize yourself having it? Do you check every morning to make sure it's still there? Of course not. That would be insane. You just assume it's yours. You don't think about it. You don't doubt it. You just live with it. That's the tone. That's the frequency. That calm, ordinary, neutral sense of ownership. That's what moves reality. Not excitement, not desperation, not hope, but that quiet inner knowing that says this is already settled. When you reach that point, something shifts. Effort disappears. Anxiety softens. The urge to control everything just fades. And in that stillness, reality rearranges itself with surprising ease. Now I know what you're thinking, but I don't feel like it's done. I can see it's not done. How am I supposed to feel something that isn't real? And that's the trap, because you're looking at the world to tell you how to feel. You're letting circumstances define your state. But circumstances have no power except the power you give them through your attention. The world is always late. It reflects yesterday's assumptions. If you react to what you see, you're agreeing to stay exactly where you are. But if you decide internally that the matter is finished, if you carry yourself accordingly and let the world catch up, then you're leading consciousness instead of being led by appearances. And consciousness always wins. Here's what nobody talks about. Feeling it as done doesn't mean you'll feel excited all the time. That's not how fulfillment works. Fulfillment is calm. Completion is neutral. When something is truly yours, you don't strain to believe it. You don't argue with doubts. You don't fight opposing thoughts. You just live from it. And living from it is what shifts everything. So how do you actually do this? How do you shift from trying to make something happen to feeling like it's already done? You start by asking yourself a different question. If this were already done, how would I move through today? How would I speak? How would I react to that email? How would I treat myself? And the answers are subtle but powerful. You wouldn't rush. You wouldn't explain yourself. You wouldn't look for permission. You wouldn't feel the need to convince anyone of anything. You'd feel steady. That steadiness is the state that cannot be resisted. The world doesn't push back against certainty. It rearranges itself around it. Resistance only appears when you're internally divided, when part of you assumes fulfillment and another part is still bracing for disappointment. But when your inner conversation ends in acceptance, the outer conversation follows. And this is where most people stumble. They try to force belief. They try to convince themselves through willpower. But belief isn't created by effort. Belief is created by familiarity. You have to sit with the feeling of this is done long enough that it begins to feel normal. At first, it might feel unreal. That's okay. That's just because you're not used to occupying that state. Stay there anyway. Reality follows familiarity, not logic. You're not meant to convince your mind through argument. You allow your mind to relax into a new assumption by repetition of feeling. When the feeling becomes natural, the mind stops questioning. And when the mind stops questioning, life stops delaying. Think of water flowing downhill. It doesn't argue. It doesn't rush. It doesn't force. Yet nothing stops it. When you're internally aligned like that, life moves with the same inevitability. The moment you stop trying to make things happen, they begin to happen. This isn't passivity, it's alignment. Action taken from completion feels different than action taken from lack. One feels strained, the other feels obvious. When you act from fulfillment, your actions are effective without effort. They feel right-timed, natural, almost accidental. That's because you're no longer pushing against life. You're moving with it, and nothing can resist you when you're no longer resisting yourself. And here's something most people never realize. Imagination isn't a tool you use occasionally when you want to manifest something. It's the place you're always living from. Even when you worry, you're imagining. Even when you fear the worst, you're imagining. The only difference is direction. When you deliberately feel the end is done, you're simply choosing the destination rather than drifting. And once chosen, it must be inhabited. You must stop looking to the world for confirmation. The world is always reflecting what was, not what is becoming. If you keep checking the outside for proof, you're agreeing to remain in yesterday's state. That's why nothing changes. You're constantly recreating what already happened by giving it your attention, your emotional agreement, your belief that this is how things are. But what if you withdrew that agreement? What if you stopped letting current circumstances define what's possible? This doesn't mean you deny what you see. It means you refuse to let it define you. You observe without identifying. You notice without submitting. You remain inwardly unmoved because you know the source is already set within you. There's a quiet authority that comes with feeling it's done. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention from others. It simply is. And that is-ness is what reshapes outcomes. Most people are so busy performing their desires, talking about them, explaining them, defending them, that they never actually settle into them. They're always one step removed, always in the energy of wanting rather than having. Now here's something crucial. If doubts arise, and they will, don't fight them. fighting gives them importance. Simply return to the feeling of done. Let doubts pass like background noise. They have no creative power unless you give them emotional weight. Your assumption is what matters, not momentary thoughts, because it's not what you think occasionally, but what you feel consistently that shapes reality. And consistency doesn't mean strain. It means returning again and again to the same inner conclusion. This is settled. This is mine. This is already accomplished. Not with excitement, with calm certainty. You don't need signs. You don't need reassurance. You don't need timelines. Time is a byproduct, not a cause. When the state is assumed, time rearranges itself accordingly. The moment you truly feel it as done, impatience disappears. Because impatience only exists when you believe something is missing. Nothing is missing when fulfillment is assumed. Your only task is to remain faithful to the inner end, not perfectly, faithfully, gently, persistently, without emotional drama. When you wake up, return to it. When you go to sleep, rest in it. When the world contradicts it, remain still. This isn't denial. This is leadership. You're leading consciousness rather than being led by appearances. And consciousness always wins. You're not here to chase outcomes. You're here to select states. Outcomes follow states as shadows follow form. Choose the form and the shadow must appear. Feeling it as done is choosing the form. Once chosen, nothing can resist you because there's nothing to resist. There's no push, no demand, no need, only assumption. An assumption hardens into fact with absolute reliability. Trust this process, not because someone told you to, but because you can observe it. Notice how life already mirrors your inner expectations. Notice how moods precede events. Notice how identity shapes experience. This isn't theory, it's law. And law doesn't argue, it operates. So decide now, quietly, without tension, that the matter is complete. Carry that completion into your movements, your reactions, your conversations, not by announcing it, by embodying it. When you embody completion, you stop negotiating with circumstances. You stop explaining yourself to doubt. You stop waiting for the right moment. The right moment is now. Not because you've earned it, not because conditions are perfect, but because you've decided it internally. And that internal decision is the only permission you ever needed. Everything you've been waiting for permission to feel, you can feel now, not as fantasy, as identity. Here's what changes when fulfillment becomes identity instead of activity. You stop trying to maintain a feeling through constant effort. The feeling maintains itself through familiarity. Once a state is familiar, it no longer requires attention. It simply operates. Just as you don't constantly think about your name to remain yourself, you don't need to constantly think about fulfillment to remain fulfilled. Identity persists without reminder. Let that understanding deepen. Let fulfillment become who you are, not what you're doing. And from that identity, everything continues to unfold naturally, quietly, steadily. You're not holding a state in place. The state is holding you. And because of that, there's a gentleness in the way you move through experiences. This is when life starts to feel different in ways that are hard to explain to others. You begin to notice that you're not forcing conversations or opportunities anymore. Things just seem to line up, not because the universe suddenly decided to be nice to you, but because your inner frequency changed. You're broadcasting a different signal, and reality, which is always listening, is responding to that signal. People might say you've changed. They might say you seem more confident, more relaxed, more certain. But you're not trying to be any of those things. You're simply resting in a state that feels complete. And completion doesn't try to prove itself. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't require applause. It just exists, quietly confident in its own reality. You listen more than you react. You observe more than you interfere. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. Action that comes from inner stillness carries accuracy. It lands where it needs to land without excess motion. Excess motion belongs to uncertainty. Certainty is economical. You no longer feel compelled to correct every misunderstanding or prove every point. When the inner conclusion is firm, external opinions lose their weight. Agreement from others becomes optional rather than necessary. This is freedom. Freedom from emotional dependency. Freedom from constant evaluation. Freedom from measuring your progress against appearances. You're no longer defined by what's happening, but by what you're assuming. And assumption, once stabilized, is creative law. You may begin to sense that even silence is productive. Moments where nothing seems to be happening are no longer uncomfortable. They're fertile. They're intervals where the unseen is reorganizing. Stillness isn't emptiness. It's preparation without anxiety. This understanding changes how you relate to pauses, delays, and waiting periods. You no longer label them as obstacles. You see them as integration, time for the inner state to fully impress itself upon form. Rushing would only disturb the impression. So you allow life its rhythm. You're not in a hurry because you're not behind. Being behind is a perception rooted in lack. Completion has no timeline pressure. This removes urgency from your system, and urgency, once removed, stops generating resistance. Resistance was never external. It was the friction created by urgency pushing against the present moment. Now the present moment feels sufficient, and because it feels sufficient, it becomes powerful. You begin to meet situations without preconceived tension. You don't enter moments expecting difficulty. You enter them expecting resolution. That expectation, though subtle, shapes outcomes before they unfold. Expectation is quiet creation. Even when things appear uncertain, your internal posture remains the same. You don't collapse inward. You don't abandon the state. You simply allow the scene to play out, knowing that scenes are temporary but states are foundational. Scenes pass, states persist. This distinction is what stabilizes you. You no longer confuse temporary images with permanent truth. You recognize that what you see is only a snapshot of motion, not the destination, because the destination has already been assumed. So you let moments come and go. You let conversations unfold. You let circumstances rearrange. You remain inwardly complete throughout. Completion isn't an event, it's a stance, and once taken, it doesn't require maintenance. It only requires non-interference. You interfere when you doubt. You interfere when you rush. You interfere when you demand proof. Without those habits, the state remains undisturbed. Think about what interference really is. It's you inserting your anxiety into the process. It's checking and testing and questioning whether it's working. But the question itself reveals the problem. If you're asking, is it working? You're still standing outside of it, evaluating it as something separate from you. But this isn't something you do. It's something you become. When you truly inhabit a state, you don't wonder if it's working any more than you wonder if breathing is working. It's automatic, it's natural, it's just what is. And the moment it becomes that natural, that ordinary, the external world has no choice but to reflect it back to you. Because the external world is never the problem, it's never the source of delay. It's simply the mirror showing you what you've been internally committed to. This is why calm is such a powerful indicator. Calm signals that you're no longer wrestling with outcome. And when the wrestling stops, the outcome is free to arrive. You continue without pushing forward, without pulling back. simply staying where you are internally, letting each moment align itself around that still center. Your nervous system relaxes, your body responds, your presence changes. Others sense it without knowing why. Situations soften around you. Opportunities present themselves without strain. This isn't mysticism, it's coherence. An inner world that's no longer divided produces an outer world that's no longer conflicted. Even your timing changes. You're no longer early or late. You arrive when things are ready for you. Because readiness isn't about clocks, it's about states aligning. You may still have preferences, intentions, directions, but they no longer feel heavy. They feel like gentle currents rather than urgent demands. You allow them to exist without gripping them. Gripping implies fear of loss. Completion has no fear, and because there's no fear, imagination becomes playful rather than desperate. You can entertain possibilities without clinging to them. You can feel outcomes without begging for them. This flexibility keeps the state fluid and alive. Rigidity slows things down. Fluidity accelerates. So if you ever feel yourself becoming rigid, overly focused, overly serious, overly invested, soften. Return to ease. Ease isn't apathy. Ease is trust in motion. Trust that what has been assumed is already unfolding in ways you cannot yet see. Trust that you don't need to supervise the process. Here's what supervision really means. It means you don't trust the state you've chosen. You're micromanaging because you're afraid it won't happen without your constant attention. But that fear is the very thing blocking the flow. When you supervise, you're saying, I've assumed it, but I don't really believe it. So I better keep watching to make sure it happens. And that watching, that monitoring, that's still the energy of lack. True assumption doesn't require watching. It requires resting. When you've genuinely accepted something as done, you don't stand guard over it. You let it be. You move on with your day. You engage with life naturally, not as someone desperately waiting for proof, but as someone who already has what they assumed and is simply living from that reality. Trust that life knows how to deliver what consciousness has accepted. Supervision belongs to doubt. Allowance belongs to knowing. And knowing doesn't need reinforcement. You're not here to maintain a feeling through constant effort. You're here to allow a feeling to maintain itself through familiarity. What once felt like discipline now feels like default. You wake up one day and realize you're no longer trying, not because you've given up, but because there's nothing left to push against. The internal resistance that once fueled effort has dissolved. Resistance was never in the world. It was always in the tension between desire and disbelief. When belief becomes natural, tension disappears. And this is where everything shifts from theory to lived experience. You stop talking about manifestation. You stop thinking about the law. You stop wondering if you're doing it right, because you're no longer doing it at all. You're simply being it. The state has become so natural, so familiar, that it's just who you are now. There's no separation between you and the fulfilled version of yourself. They're the same person. You've merged. This merger isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or sudden revelations. It's quiet. It's subtle. One day you just notice that you're not checking anymore. You're not waiting anymore. You're not hoping anymore. You're just living, living from the assumption that it's done. And in that living, everything you assumed shows up, not as a miracle, but as the most natural thing in the world. Because of course it showed up. It was always going to show up. You decided it would, and you never undecided. So understand this and take it with you. You don't change your life by chasing outcomes, convincing circumstances, or waiting for permission from the world. You change it the instant you decide internally, emotionally, and completely that the matter is finished. The moment you feel it's done, the struggle ends. And when the struggle ends, resistance has nothing left to stand on. You were never meant to fight reality. You were meant to set it. When you stop asking and start assuming, life has no choice but to rearrange itself around your certainty, not because you demanded it, but because you became it. What you accept as true within becomes law without. So leave here with this single authority established inside you. Settle the end first. Feel the relief. Feel the calm. Feel the naturalness of having. Don't negotiate with appearances. Don't explain yourself to delay. Stand quietly in the inner completion and let the world do what it must. Because when the state is fulfilled, the outcome is inevitable. Feel it as done, and nothing at all can resist you.